All right. Thank you so much for coming to KCD webinar. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce my dear colleague, Brian Scassellati, who is the Bartlett Giamatti Professor of Computer Science at Yale University. So he designs these very interesting social robots that support a lot of different settings for autism therapy, early childhood education, and dementia support and care. And when I first heard about this his research, I thought this is something that is extremely important to Korea. As you all know, Korean society is getting old and there's this term called dementia money. So in Korean language, we call it 치매 money. We still use the money in Korean. I don't know why, but 치매 is dementia. So what that means is the asset that is not properly invested and managed by elderly people because of dementia. And I actually got really surprised that it is, as of now, it is about 6% of Korean GDP. So that's huge. And as Korea is getting older and older, and if that support is becoming increasingly important, and I am very excited to present Professor Scassellati to Korean government and industry partners. So his research combines these two different disciplines, the tech-based disciplines that include robotics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Also, with the human-centered disciplines such as psychology, sociology, and cognitive science. So that's he is sitting in a very unique interdisciplinary field, which is again necessary for such support that we really need. He's a fellow of AAAI and a very prestigious Alfred P. Sloan Fellow and has received many, many awards. But last but not least, I want to also tell you that Professor Scassellati is a night owl. What that means is that he likes to work overnight, which is actually really perfect because he works in Korean time. So if you develop collaboration, you're going to have a real-time conversation with Professor Scassellati. So hope you remember that when you develop your collaboration. Great. I'm going to turn my microphone to Professor Scassellati. Here you go, man.
Jan, thank you so much. And wonderful to see so many people and so many some familiar names and faces. Um, I'm going to try uh, to make an argument tonight about why certain applications in robotics, why the time for them has finally come. So in the robotics world, we often think about very traditional robotics, and we think about the dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs. And these are the kinds of things that traditional robotics and traditional engineering has done quite an excellent job of producing systems uh, to deal with very complex environments, very difficult tasks, the kinds of tasks that we don't want humans doing. But from an industrial standpoint, these are very niche categories. You might get a chance to sell a few thousand ordnance disposal robots or a few tens of thousands of inspection robots. But from a standpoint of consumer electronics, these are very small markets. Um, when we think about robotics today, we often think about robots moving into the home. And that's where enormous markets really exist. But the difficulty there is that the home is an incredibly complex place from the standpoint of traditional robotics. If I want to think about trying to navigate in these difficult environments, in very small spaces with high amounts of clutter, where there's constant change and very fine tolerances, or I want to think about doing perception in this very challenging environment where there's an enormous amount of occlusion, where you have deformable items that may appear differently. and you have a large number of items just throughout the household. Or even if I want to think about computational reasoning and dealing with the non-stationary items or with items that have hidden exposed values, or things like manipulation where you have soft and deformable items. Basically, all of the cases that we don't do a terribly good job at. Navigation, perception, manipulation, all of these traditional robotics fields, when we move into the home, they become so complex that they border on being nearly impossible. So, why am I excited about robots in the home? If we can't do these traditional robotics tasks there, what is the idea behind pushing systems into the consumer electronics market? And for me, it's really because there's an entirely separate category of robotics that doesn't deal with traditional engineering measures. And where while we leverage perception and manipulation and reasoning, those often take a secondary stance to things like interaction design and social performance. And we call this area socially assistive robotics. Here, the robot serves a critical purpose, not providing some physical task performance, but rather providing some sort of social or cognitive support. And these systems have been very successful in areas like education and looking at children with autism or diabetes management. But we're seeing more and more of them also in areas like rehabilitation and dementia care. Now, this area comes with its own set of difficulties. You do have to think about robots in the wild, and robots being in homes still has real difficulties. You need to think about dealing with sensitive data, often dealing with very personal data, very healthcare focused data that you may not want to share readily with everyone. You have to look at systems that survive not over periods of minutes or hours, but over months or years in order to be useful in the consumer space. And you need systems that can learn and adapt and personalize themselves to the individual needs of a specific user. So while we don't deal with necessarily the complexity of traditional perception and manipulation, we do have some very challenging areas that need to be addressed. Now, why should you listen to me? Why would you, uh, take my word for it? Well, we probably have within my group and my team more experience in working at robots that actually go out in the home than any other group in the world. I had one of my students who just finished their dissertation count up the number of times that they actually had robots out in the wild. And we found that they served somewhere almost near 300 different families, that they tracked almost 13,000 hours of operation with their robots, over 3,000 different sessions, and they provided almost 1,000 hours of active therapy and generated somewhere around 85 terabytes of multimodal data. And that's from one of my students. Collectively, we have more experience and more knowledge about how these systems go into homes today than we have ever had before. So, over the next 30 or 40 minutes, I want to give you a sense of what some of these systems can do, what they look like, by giving you four different short applications, telling you about some of the things that we have been successful in doing. And then I want to come back and talk about what the future of consumer grade in-home robotics is going to look like. And that's when we'll talk a little bit more about dementia care and the problems that both the US and Korea, along with a number of other very large markets in the world, are starting to face. Okay. So let me start with looking at not in the home, but in schools. For about 15 years, my team has built systems that are designed as tutoring systems that work with children across a range of ages to try to provide some sort of tutoring support, helping them to learn a specific topic. But in the last year, we've focused not just on providing information, but on helping children manage themselves within the classroom. And this came from a collaboration with the New York City public school systems, one of the largest public school systems in the US, where every school within New York City was mandated last year to have what they called a de-escalation space. So for early elementary schools, for kindergarten through about fifth, sixth grade, that meant having some specialized space, some specialized area where if you had a child who was having trouble regulating their emotions, where they were having difficulty, where they might have been getting angry or violent or just frustrated, that they could go, that they could take a little bit of time, that they could get themselves back under control, and then resume their normal classrooms. Now, the goal in all of this was always for the children to be able to learn how to regulate their own physical bodies and their physical forms, but then to be able to return them to classrooms as quickly as possible. That is, to take their complex state as it was and bring it back under control so that they could go in and return back to their classrooms as quickly as possible. To help aid this process, we went to New York City and we started installing robots into the public schools to help children make that transition away from these de-escalation spaces and back to the regular classroom. So using a set of off-the-shelf desktop robots that we had reprogrammed, we built a system to help kids do this social and emotional regulation so that when they were frustrated, when they were angry, when they were having difficulty, that they had a moment to regroup, take that break, but then get back to the classroom as quickly as they could. This robot did a number of different things, but it was embedded within the classrooms within a dozen different schools for a period of about a month. And in those classrooms, the design goal, again, of the robot was for the children to use the robot as little as possible. We wanted them not to be attracted to the robot, but rather for the robot to help transition them back to the regular classroom teaching that they were missing at the time. So this robot used a number of different strategies. It would greet children and engage them in some small talk, talk about what they were doing there, how their day was going. It would perform activities meant on refocusing them, like deep breathing, so slight meditation techniques, where they could use that robot to talk a little bit about creating and getting control over their environment, to do a metacognitive reflection task, and then for them again to transition back to the classroom. Now, these systems, when we put them out there, were, well, we weren't sure it was going to work. The idea that we could put an attractive robot into a school and not have children flock to it, well, that was kind of an odd idea. But in fact, in every one of the schools that we visited, as the robot spent a number of time, an amount of time in the school over the course of the month, the number of children who engaged with that robot, the number of children who were there with that system decreased over time. That is, they spent less and less time with the robot, and they spent fewer and fewer visits while the robot was there to the de-escalation room. And that meant that they were getting back into class using less time, they were missing less in the classroom, and they were able to resume their day much faster. So many times when we look at the value of these systems, we're looking at some ideas that are counterintuitive. Yes, the robot could directly tutor and provide direct exposure to the different kinds of classroom material. But more importantly, we could actually help these children get back to their human teachers as quickly as they could. All right, let me go on to a second one that we have probably an even greater amount of exposure with, and that is working with children with autism. For the last 15 years, we've done social skills training for kids with autism, culminating up to the point where we were initially doing this with small scale exposures in the laboratory to now where we send robots home with families with the idea that the child and the family will be able to use that robot in the same way that they would have a visit with a therapist. Only the robot is there every day at their disposal when the family is ready and able to use it. These machines, again, conduct what are very typical social skills trainings. They do the same kinds of exposures that our therapists would do if they were able to visit the home every day. They play the same kinds of games that are designed and used by therapists when they visit homes individually. And they operate in very complex real world situations. Um, Being able to deal with the complexity of this individual home and that individual home is one of the things that makes this really challenging. Um, as a very simple example, we had one family who put the robot in the front of their living space, in a window facing out into the morning sun, because they wanted everybody in the neighborhood to see that they had this robot that was working with them. And that meant when they sat in front of the robot in the morning to do their daily therapy, that the robot could see nothing but these backlit silhouettes as the sun came in. We had a second family who had much less space, and instead of putting the robot out into the open like that, the only place they had for the robot was in the basement, where there was a single light bulb dangling on a string going back and forth that made it almost look like it was a scene from a horror movie. You would only ever see one half of the family from either the left or the right, depending on which way the light was swinging at the moment. Now, we did this in the home deliberately because we wanted to have systems that were fully autonomous, that could do this kind of adaptation and this kind of skills training without having any human involvement. And so for 30 days, we had no contact with these systems. And we asked the family to go ahead and every day practice with the system, engage with the robot, and work day after day to be able to see whether or not their children would improve on different these different tests. Now, sure enough, the kids did actually improve in each one of the social skills games that we presented to them. And in fact, we can chart how well they were doing over time very easily by looking at their score or how well they were doing within each game. What was perhaps even more important to us, though, is that each one of the families, we asked them to report at the beginning and the end of the month, and they all reported to us that their children were making better attempts at making eye contact, better attempts at initiating communication, better attempts at responding to communication. And when we took this data and we tried to use the most complex and the most rigorous evaluation techniques we could, we brought in external advisors. We brought in an external team of clinicians who measured the performance of these children at the beginning and end of each month. We tracked the children for 30 days before the robot arrived to see whether they were doing something in school or in their other therapies, something that might count to increase their social skill potential. And in fact, none of the children showed any performance improvement then. But in 30 days with the robot, every one of our families improved. Every one of our kids showed performance gains across nearly every social skill that we measured. And then finally, we measured it for 30 days after the robot was gone. Now, in that 30 days, every single one of the children started to lose some of the skills that they had gained. That's actually to be expected. We don't have any 30-day skill training systems, even in the best human design systems. We don't have any that work over just 30 days. It takes much more practice than that to be effective. But just to show you what kinds of differences you could see, within the first week, you could see differences starting to happen. So here's a child during the first week with her grandmother playing a game with the robot. And you can see that she's very focused on the tablet on the screen. She's very focused on the robot. She's not really interested in what the grandmother is doing. Even when the grandmother is engaging in the game, she's watching her finger. She's not actually playing with her grandmother. But even after a week, even after, in this case, 3 weeks, we can see the difference in the child's performance and the child's behavior. Now, suddenly, when the robot turns and looks at the grandparent, the child turns and looks at the grandparent. And we start seeing the kinds of interactions that the families are craving. This is where we see families get really excited and really start to engage with these systems because suddenly they're getting the kinds of interactions with their children that they've been looking for all along, that they have been missing. Here's one mother who, at the end of her research time, the end of her month, we asked them to record just a little bit to tell us about how things had gone. And here's a small excerpt of what she sent us.
We can't hear the video, Scott.
Oh, let me do this then. I think I maybe didn't share it properly.
Yeah, when you share, there's a
There we go.
that you need to click. Yeah.
All right, let's try that again.
Sometimes the therapies
How's
are
that?
they get a little exhausting and he's not excited, and this one wasn't like that. He was ready to play at 7:30 in the morning. That we went to the playground one day, and I noticed immediately there was a group of children playing in the sand, and he walked up to them and said, "Hi, what are you doing?" And I don't think he would have done that a month ago.
So we see families reporting to us that their kids are taking what they've learned with the robot and actually using that in other situations, using that at the playground, meeting other kids. In fact, this family, we noticed something odd in the video. We normally only see the family once at the beginning of the month and once at the end, but there was something really startling here. And when I looked, I saw something very different because at the beginning of the month, this this family that there were photographs and books and all sorts of items on the shelves there. And so I asked the family, I asked the mother, I said, what happened? And she told me a story that I wish I had known along the way. But she said, look, we knew that we had the robot for only a month, but in the first week, my husband works for the electrical company, and when there's going to be a bad storm somewhere, we often get sent to that new location, and the company comes and they move all of our household items for us, and we move to the new location and we're centered there so that when the storm arrives, my husband is there. He goes works on the repair crews. And she said at the beginning of the month, we were told that we were going to have to move right away, only we didn't think that we could take the robot with us. And so what the family decided to do is the father and the older child moved to the new location, took all of the family belongings with them, while the mother and the younger child stayed in the old home, slept on the floor on sleeping bags, and stayed with the robot because that was worth it for them. They felt that was an exchange that was in their best interest. Now, I wish I had known we'd have been happy to send the robot with them, but again, with no contact with them, we didn't know. This is how much it means to the families and how quickly it can become important to them. Now, we've started to see these robots come out, and in fact, my group has worked with two different companies to bring some of these products to market. Both of them, the first is Moxie from a company called Embodied. They had a nice long run, but they've now been the company has folded. And Van Robotics, that's actually still doing extremely well. They have robots. They're focused on the educational side. And they have robots in somewhere near 3,000 different school districts, and they're doing extremely well. So we know it's possible for these systems to actually get out there and work well now. And now we're starting to see not just these very small topic areas, but we're starting to see it expand outward into more and more broad areas. So while we were focused initially on here healthcare and social skills training for children with autism, in fact, the larger area is looking at adults with autism and looking at job skills training. So we've started using some of these same robots now, but not designed to do basic, simple social skills, but to do things like answer questions about how do you get through an interview? How do you deal with interpersonal problems on a job site? How do you, especially for our adults with autism, sit around the water cooler and have that kind of low level, simple conversation that we often call small talk? Small talk is something that's extremely difficult for many adults with autism, but it's a very critical social element in almost every job. It has a certain characteristic standpoint, though. When we're talking about adults who have difficulty in initiating conversations, difficulty in varying what they're saying, they have very limited interests in areas that aren't within their specific spheres, and some real social anxiety. Now, suddenly, you have adults with ASD, adults with autism, who are reporting that these are one of the things that's really keeping them from maintaining a job. So, we've started looking at ways in which we can bring some of what we've been able to build and focused on with children, now looking at with adults with autism. Are we able to take more complex large language models that are available today and focus them on being able to do skills training? Now, most large language models, you take them out of the box and they're terrible conversation partners. They're designed to answer questions, not to hold a conversation. So we often have to take these LLMs and create entirely new systems through a combination of techniques like fine tuning, in which we reshape the underlying state space of what's exposed to and what's trained within the system. A little bit of prompt engineering, where we apply static boundaries to the kinds of things that the system is allowed to say and allowed to produce. And with more complex techniques like observer overlays, where we use context sensitive techniques to be able to define variable types of spaces and permit some and prohibit others. So, for example, here we use a second LLM as a type of observer to watch the feedback from the first LLM and determine whether or not it is obeying certain rules that we put in place about the way small talk should be generated. Luckily enough, we know that with small talk, there are certain strict rules to be followed. You don't answer with long sentences when you're just having a casual conversation. You don't ever answer a question with something that is highly emotionally charged. You don't answer with something that is too specific. And so by taking these, we're able to create systems that we can trust to use more complex language generation in real world settings. So for this system now requires a large number of individual components combined with a set of these guardrail rules about how the system should behave. But we're able to do that and put that out into real settings. Here it is in a deployment with 25 different families in the home, where every day they had a few hours of casual conversation collectively with these robots. And in fact, within just a week, we see adults with autism make more eye contact appropriately during these conversations. We see them initiate conversations with the robot much more readily. And we see their response duration, the way in which they talk, the length in which they talk, actually become much, much closer to typical human-human performance as they spend more time with the robot. What does this look like? Well, here's an example.
Hi. I'm so excited to see you.
Hope you're having a great day. That's awesome to hear. Anything exciting happening today?
I went to the beach.
Going to the beach sounds like so much fun.
That's the thing.
Was the weather
Did you
nice
see
there?
that?
Did you do any swimming or just enjoy the sunshine?
I just enjoyed the sand.
Thanks for chatting with me. It's good to share personal experiences like going to the beach, as it helps create a connection. Keep up the friendly tone and you did well in showing interest in the other person's hobbies. To improve, try to be more proactive in sharing about your own interests or experiences. This can help deepen the connection in the conversation.
Thank you.
And so we produce systems that not only act as practice partners, but can actually give real feedback on how they're doing. And people tend to really like them. They come back after them day after day, look to that system, and actually start then trying to use these techniques as they go out into the real world. Finally, as one other small example, I'll give you a different robot here. This is a robot called OMI that we use for mental health care. And we're working right now with a combination of different populations, including both children and adults with social anxiety, with long-term depression. And one of the things that they use this robot for is to practice deep breathing exercises. Now, deep breathing is something that's very easy to teach someone how to do. The real question is, if you know it, have you practiced it well enough so that when you do encounter a situation that makes you anxious and afraid, have you practiced it enough that you can use it immediately then? So the real role of the robot isn't to provide information. It's very easy to tell someone how to do this, but rather to give them that prompt to practice this skill again and again until it becomes second nature to them. Now, by putting their hands on the robot expands and contracts, and it's just their job to follow along with the cadence that the robot produces. We've tested this out in a number of different situations. Next month, we'll be putting this into homes with children 12 to 14 years old with social anxiety. We've also done this under very stressful conditions. This was in one of the local hospitals. These are children who are undergoing some allergy testing, where we have children who have severe allergies like peanut allergies, where we know that they have a risk uh, of having a very bad reaction to that substance. And for various medical reasons, they often have to be retested every few years to see whether or not they still have that same reaction. And so we have to bring these 6 and 7 year olds into the clinic, and we have to ask them to expose themselves to the subject of their allergy. So if you're allergic to peanuts, come into the clinic and we're going to feed you peanuts for the next 3 hours. And both for the child who's been taught for their entire life that you can never eat peanuts, you might die if you eat peanuts. And for the families, this can be extremely stressful. But here, again, we bring kids in, we show them how to use the robot. They wake the robot up by rubbing its stomach, and they can practice the deep breathing exercises with it. And even when they're under this kind of stress, we find them often return to the robot as a way of being able to reset themselves, to relax again, and then go off and resume what they were doing before. And so when we make this robot available for free use, they can come over and they can use the robot whenever they like. We'll find that many of the children will come over every 30 to 45 minutes,
Very good
do a little
job.
deep breathing with the robot, relax again, and then go off and play
And
again.
whenever you feel like it, you can come use it.
And it makes a very big difference into the way they respond within the clinic. Okay, so I've given a bunch of different examples and I've talked about some of the ways in which we've deployed these systems in the past and the uses that we've had with specialized populations. But let me take just a few more minutes and talk about what I think is really the future for consumer in-home robotics. I started off by saying that things like perception and manipulation, while these were very important problems, they were still very, very difficult problems that were beyond the scope of most of what we could do today. In fact, in many case situations, what we can do out there in the real world is very, very limited by these real constraints. But the demand and the need is there in such an immense way that this social applications will become the application of choice for in-home systems in the near future. Now, what's driving that? Well, the biggest things are number one, changes in the demographics of our populations, both in the US, in Korea, in Japan, in Italy, in other parts of Europe. We're seeing people living longer lives. We're seeing the birth rate going down. And so as a result, we're starting to cross a boundary where within the next 10 years, many of these economies will have more adults over the age of retirement than they will have children under the age of 18. More seniors than children. And as that shift occurs, it's not going to be a small change. It's going to be a very drastic change. The focus that's going to have to go along with this is some way of increasing the amount of services that we can provide to these seniors. Many of them are going to have a lack of family support because of the way that our economies are forcing longer and longer periods until retirement. We are going to see an increase in the number of individuals who are isolated because of the rise of 1- and 2-person households. And we're going to see fewer and fewer opportunities for us to provide the kinds of healthcare and logistical support that many of these families will need because economically they won't be able to support it. So for all of these reasons, we know that this is an area where technology has an important role to play. And how exactly we shape that technology over the next few years will very much influence the kinds of techniques that are available, the kinds of systems, and the way in which we view the role of technology in these very critical societal problems. My group has been working to take many of the elements that we've been using in classrooms, in homes already, and to specialize them for older adults. So we've taken systems like OMI, this self-breathing system, and adapting it to use within a wider environment with healthcare challenges that are now very different than what we faced before. One of our test beds has been a senior living facility here in Connecticut, where we've been lucky enough to work with about 36 families who have at least of the one of the seniors who is living with dementia. And as that disease progresses, as we see more and more changes in what they're capable of doing, we're looking at ways in which we can help support the family as a whole, not only to provide direct support to the adult with dementia, but also worrying about things like, can we provide enough support so that their caregivers, their spouses, are able to continue working with them, living with them on a day-to-day basis? Can we provide enough support so that they can continue to remain in their individual homes so that they're not starting to take up spots within an institution or some other type of shared living facility. As we do this, we see more and more that the role of these robots is not to provide some type of physical support. We're not looking at, can you carry the heavy bags of groceries or can you put the dishes away? But rather, we're looking at those much more social and cognitive tasks of, can you help us stay connected to each other? Can you help reduce frustration and caregiver burnout by working with the family and answering common questions that otherwise get asked over and over again all day, each day? And yes, occasionally using techniques like, can we find commonly misplaced items in the home? Where are my glasses? Where is my TV remote? Where are my car keys? The most often asked questions out there. And sometimes it's an easy to identify object that's right out in the open. And sometimes it's an object that has a particular place, like in a cabinet. And sometimes it's an object that, well, gets lost in a couch in these places that are not typically places that we might look for them. And again, different ways in which we can support the family here. In some cases, it might be a great idea for us to have a robotic system that can say, I think I saw your remote over there in the drawer. Or I noticed you put something in the drawer. Maybe you should check there and see if it's there. Whereas for something like car keys, well, I know that with my own father, as he got to the point where he was very interested in driving, but not safe to be driving, we would often not tell him where his car keys were very deliberately. Can we build systems that help understand the differences there? So when we think about ways in which we can support an adult and a family who has a senior who's aging, who's starting to live with dementia, we look at ways in which we can think about reducing stress on that individual. We look at ways in which we can support caregivers. Maybe we can use deep breathing as a way to quickly get a reduction in stress. But maybe the much better solution is for us to be able to answer questions about, can we go out for a drive, so that that frees up the partner to go off and actually take some time and schedule a doctor's appointment or be able to balance their checkbook. Sometimes it's in forms of just, can we refocus their attention? Can we move them away from doing dangerous or impossible activities? Sometimes it's about being able to generate some of those good positive experiences. The most popular thing that we do right now in the assisted living facility is karaoke. The number one requested thing we see is, over and over again, they want to sing songs from their childhood. And when we can find that and we can share that with the partners, or we can share that with the children, that actually often forms an even stronger bond.
Koreans are crazy about singing, Scott.
I knew that that would be a successful story right at the end here. So this is exactly the kinds of things that we think about when we think about robots going out into the home. Can we build systems that integrate with the family, that are able to provide actually useful things, but without having to solve every difficult robotics challenge that there is? That's where I'm going to make my argument for today, that when we think about going off into these very difficult settings with very real challenges, that in fact, it's these social challenges that are the ones that we're likely to be able to solve and likely to be able to provide real support for. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll get you back into your Wednesday morning without too much of a delay. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Brian. I was listening to your talk, and that really remind me about my younger days in Korea. We have this English listening test, and there's a narrator that like speaks at the perfect speed with a perfect pronunciation.
Mm.
And it was like you were so clear. So I understood everything that you said, which was great. Well, any questions? 한국말로 질문하셔도 되고요. So, as you might know, Koreans are not really aggressive in asking questions, but that does
No,
not mean that they're
we're
not
accustomed to that in the
interested.
robotics world.
Yeah, I left email addresses for myself and Junyoung Park, who is the KCD coordinator. So please do not hesitate to contact me or Junyoung Park for any questions about KCD. I also left Professor Brian Scassellati's website, his social robotics lab, and his email address. So please do not hesitate to contact me. Again, I want to conclude today's presentation by saying that me personally, this is something one of the most important things that Korea needs to address. And I'm so glad that Brian is working on this along with many other people. Because I will get older at some point. I don't have dementia. I'm far from it, but I still cannot remember where I placed my keys. So, so I'm sure and we
My
are in the
my my young graduate students fight over who gets to take that system home. They all want to have it and find all their missing items.
right. I don't think I will have enough money to do the blood transfusion like Brian Johnson, but I'm sure I can afford to buy the robots that Brian makes. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Any questions? If not, we are going to conclude today's webinar. And as I said, the recording is going to be uploaded in the KCD website in a day or two. Please spread this webinar so that many people can watch Professor Scassellati's interesting research. Thank you so much. Mr. You want to say something?